Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Great to be back with y'all. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who is professor of economics at Hillsdale College. Well, you used to be Ludwig von Mises professor of economics at Hillsdale, and so used to saying that still. Now at the Citadel, professor of economics at the Citadel. Good to have you back, Richard.
It's great to be with you. I'm the BB&T Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership here at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina. All
right. Well, I thought we'd discuss gun control today because GOP presidential candidate Ben Carson has stirred up a political firestorm with a comment that said that the gun control in Nazi Germany really did have an effect with respect to the Holocaust. He suggested that if Jews had been free to own guns, that would have significantly diminished the impact of the Holocaust. In other words, a lot of Jewish lives could have been saved as a result. And, of course, the gun control critics here in the United States immediately went on the attack, saying this is ridiculous. The Nazi state is so powerful that there was no way that this small minority of people in Germany, I think the Jews consist of 1%, could have had an effect against this all-powerful police state military machine. And, of course, then some of the gun rights advocates like David Koppel and Stephen Holbrook responded to this. Koppel said, well, no, there really were instances of where Jews did have guns and they were able to successfully resist in terms of getting a couple of concentration camps closed because of all the chaos that came with the resistance, and they diverted Hitler's resources away from the war effort. And I look at this, Richard, but my response is that even if they were going to lose their lives, people have a right to defend themselves against tyranny. I mean, this is what the Declaration of Independence says, that, you have a right to overthrow a tyrannical regime with force, and force includes guns. People have a right to own guns. They have a right to resist tyranny. And even if a group of Jews knew they were going to lose and their only option is surrender and go get killed in the concentration camp, or fight and possibly prevail, possibly inspire other people to join up with you, but at least going down fighting and maybe taking as few German Nazi soldiers with you, that they certainly had that right. And it seems to me that that's what the gun control advocate, that's one of the points the gun control advocates miss. What do you say?
Well, first of all, how it would have turned out if more people in Germany, including Jews, had been armed, how it all would have turned out, of course, is all speculative history. What we do know as an historical fact is that in 1943, the Nazi leadership decided to, quote, clear out the Warsaw ghetto of the Jews and to send them to the concentration camps and the death camps. And the remaining population in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw decided to resist. And with only a handful of weapons and handmade weapons such as Molotov cocktails and some rifles and small arms and so on, they were able to hold off the German occupation army in the city of Warsaw for weeks with hardly any armaments to defend themselves by determination, effort, and absolute insistence that they would go down fighting. The tragedy of that is that the Polish underground itself was unwilling to either give or even sell armaments to the Jews in the ghetto to better defend themselves. But that is one instance. I would make it even a broader case. Imagine if gun ownership had been legitimate through all the countries of Europe that Hitler ended up invading. France, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Austria, Poland itself, and so on and so forth. All of these countries that came under German occupation. Let us suppose that the general attitude had been people have a right of self-defense, including the use of armament force, that they could have legally such armaments in their home. I would suggest that the German taking over and then the occupation of these countries in general would have been made much more costly for them, would have been much more debilitating for their war effort, and might very well have deterred their decision to invade at least some of these countries. I'll just use one example where it at least was partly a rationale for a deterrence, and that was Switzerland. What was Hitler's ideological manifesto? That all the German people of Europe needed to be unified into one common nation state, of course, under his leadership. Now, Switzerland has a diverse population of German, French, and Italian-speaking people, and the German-speaking part is rather large. It would be logical, therefore, that having annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, having successfully invaded the lowlands and the occupation of France, that Switzerland would be next on the hit list. Well, in fact, Switzerland remained neutral throughout the Second World War. And one reason is the fact that in Switzerland, it was expected, it was actually mandatory that adult men were expected to go through military training and to have an armament in their home for protection of the homeland if the country was ever to be invaded. Now, given that, and of course the severe alpine terrain that would have made an invasion more difficult than just a flat area country like Holland, the fact is that it truly was clearly one of the ingredients that made Hitler and the Nazis hesitant to invade Switzerland. In other words, occupy and conquer everything else, and then we'll invade Switzerland, because that's going to be a hard nut to crack. Imagine that everyone throughout Europe had that ability to have armaments legally and in their homes. What the Germans did would have been much more difficult in all of occupied Europe, and that includes the fate of a lot of Jews. There were Jews who escaped, and these Jews that escaped went into the forest and formed partisan groups, and they got armaments, often overrunning some Germans and stealing their equipment, overrunning some little barracks by the Germans and capturing more ammunition in that way, and so on. And they were extremely ferocious in the forests in Eastern Europe, precisely because they had the means to defend themselves and to fight back. So it's an important element in the right to bear arms, that there are instances in human history of which the founding fathers themselves spoke, that not only are there private criminals and aggressors and invaders of your home and threatening your life and your family, but there are instances where a government becomes oppressive or a foreign invader, and it certainly is the right of the people, every individual, to protect himself, his family, from such occupation, enslavement, or even threatened death.
Yeah, wasn't there a movie not too long ago about the Jewish partisans that were fighting in the forests? Did you see that?
Yes. If I remember correctly, it actually stars the fellow who plays James Bond now in the movies. I forget his first name. Craig. He actually he played in the movie. He plays one of the leaders of this Jewish partisan group in the forests in Eastern Europe. Yes. Yeah,
it was a great movie. Wish we could remember the names to recommend it to people. But I can recommend a fantastic book by Stephen Holbrook called Target Switzerland, which is right along the lines of what you're talking about. And Holbrook points out that Hitler really wanted to invade Switzerland, partly for the reason you point out, that he felt this should be part of the Greater Reich, but also because it was separating his forces that were in Italy. That by absorbing Switzerland, then it'd be one continuous whole for him to coordinate troop movements between Germany and Italy. Mm-hmm. But his advisor said, if you do this, the probability is we will win anyway, but you will pay such an enormous price that you will really regret winning in this way. Because as you point out, every Swiss citizen was armed, as they are today. They all had rifles in their homes. They all knew where to go. There was no big standing army, a permanent army like America has today. That there were citizen soldiers, but everybody knew where to go in the event of an emergency. And so,
absolutely,
Hitler's advisor says it's just not worth it. And so it kind of shows you that widespread gun ownership is an insurance policy. that it can deter an invader from taking over your country as compared to everybody disarmed. An invader says, all we got to do is defeat the government's forces and that'll be the end of it. But when the citizens are armed, all of a sudden they have to start dealing with ambushes and obstructions, and occupying a country is sometimes much more difficult than just the invading of the country. So yeah, I agree with you. You're looking at separate things. You've got the hunting rights argument, that we often hear that one. You've got the protection against private criminals, that murderers and rapists and thieves. They never give a hoot for gun control laws, and that's what people on the left don't get sometimes, that when you pass a gun control law, you're really just disarming the peaceful, law-abiding people and preventing them from defending themselves. You've got the protection against invaders, and Switzerland's a good example, and then the other countries where people were disarmed, Hitler was quickly able to conquer. And then you've got the resistance against the tyranny of your very own government. And I think that was the primary motivation behind our founding fathers demanding the enactment of the Second Amendment. Remember, when the Constitution proposed the federal government, Americans were not enthusiastic about this thing. They'd been operating under the Articles of Confederation, with a very weak central government, didn't even have the power to tax. They didn't trust government power. They said, no, you bring this federal government into existence, it's going to do bad things to people. But they finally bought the argument of enumerated limited rights, but they said, even that's not enough for us. So if you look at the First Amendment, it's addressed to the federal government. It's saying, we want to make it clear that you cannot do this legally. So they were concerned about them doing it. And the Second Amendment was saying, don't even think about taking away our weaponry ever, because this is the means by which we resist tyranny. And so those were the rationales behind gun ownership in the Second Amendment, Richard.
I also am always amazed by many people in the feminist movement who defend the right, not only the legal rights of women, but often point out that women are sometimes significantly abused and taken care of and violated by a man who is just physically, on average, much stronger than her. Yet, with the recognition that rape and other violent acts often occur against women, and that women are, to use a totally politically incorrect phrase, in terms of physical strength, on average and in general, the weaker sex, that I don't see why more feminists would not realize that an equalizer is a handgun in a woman's purse or pocket, and that an aggressor, a rapist, would have to give second thoughts as to whether he should run the risk of attempting this if he cannot be sure that the woman who he accosts on the street or whose house he breaks into might very well have the means of lethally defending herself with a firearm. That is a great equalizer to make a woman physically far more equal to the brute force of a man. And I'm just amazed that the feminists, because of their ideological fads and fashions and mascots, are unwilling to see the importance of gun rights for women against physical abuse by others.
Yeah, and there's been countless instances where that's taken place. I just recently I read about a woman who was encountered an intruder in her house, and he was going to kill her, and she was reaching in her safe or something like that to get some money to give to him, and pulls out a gun out of the safe, unbeknownst to him, and starts firing. And this guy hobbles out of the house. Because that's the equalizer. And the same principle applies to men as well, that can't stand up against a huge bully, a powerful, 6'5" guy versus a 5'3" guy. The gun becomes the great equalizer. It's your means of self-defense against the big, powerful bully. And what ends up happening, as you well know, is they end up disarming the women in society, the people that are the victims of bullies and robbers and murderers and so forth. Because, like I said earlier, the guy who's going to violate a law against murder or rape or theft or robbery, he's not going to comply with a with a gun control law, and you see it in these gun-free zones. I mean, where do these mass murderers attack? They don't go to gun shows. I've never heard of a mass murder taking place at a gun show. You know, they always take place in a gun-free zone, like public schools or churches and the like. So yeah, it's a means of self-defense. But you know, one of the other arguments we often hear, Richard, is that, oh, well, it wouldn't make any difference as far as tyranny here in the United States. For one thing, there's no chance of a tyrannical regime ever taking power in the United States. This is an exceptional country. That only happens in foreign countries. And anyway, the federal government's so powerful that what good would a few assault rifles in the hands of the citizenry do? Well, my response is that it's, again, an insurance policy, that would-be tyrants will think twice about trying to impose tyranny on the American people, precisely because they know that so many people are armed. And that doesn't mean that you have to get armed. The fact that other people are armed provides a realm of safety for you. Same thing with like concealed carry. You don't have to conceal carry, but if you're sitting in a restaurant and some mass murderer comes in, you're going to benefit over the fact that 10 people in that restaurant are going to be pulling out their concealed weapons right away. So yeah, it's an insurance policy against tyranny. It's an insurance policy on self-defense. It's what the founders had in mind. One of the best quotes I ever heard, Richard, was on by Alex Kaczynski, a federal judge in the Ninth Circuit, who wrote that, you know, citizens who enact gun control laws that disarm the citizenry, that a free people will only make that mistake once. And obviously the point is that because once you do it and then you end up with that tyrannical regime, you can't correct the error, because at that point, your only option at that point is to say yes when they start carting you away to the concentration camp. It's too late to say, oh, well, can we get armed again to resist your tyranny? So Kaczynski had it right. Don't make the mistake of letting these people disarm you.
Well, the thing is that part of the lesson of what an armed population can do is the consequences of America's invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. If the populations of Afghanistan and Iraq had either been disarmed to begin with, which of course Saddam Hussein, I presume, had attempted to do to some extent, if not rather successfully, but if the people of Afghanistan and Iraq had remained disarmed, America would have won these invasions, or these war invasions. But the fact that particularly in Afghanistan, everybody has a rifle there, right? It's part of their culture. The fact that in Iraq, it was a sieve in which armaments could flow in. What you have is a ragtag group of quote, third world guerrilla fighters. And they brought the United States to a standing, screeching halt in both instances of this. That it shows that even the mighty can be stopped in its tracks by individuals. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not endorsing or supporting the Taliban or the religious nuts in Iraq. I'm just talking about the dynamics of when people have weapons that they can resist against those who they view as their enemies. It can be extremely successful, even if the person that they're viewing as an enemy is this world military giant.
Yeah, that's a great point. That I recall reading somewhere that actually Saddam Hussein had very liberal gun rights in Iraq. Apparently, he wasn't too concerned about the citizenry using those guns against him, because my recollection is that a lot of people owned guns under his regime. Now let's go to another country. You know, one of the countries that I've done a lot of studying on is Chile, and I think it has valuable lessons, because here you had the U.S. government orchestrate the coup that ousted Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of the country, a self-avowed Marxist who had been elected president. The U.S. national security state, led by President Nixon, orchestrates over a 3-year period a coup there, knowing full well what this coup is going to bring into existence. And it brings into existence this brutal military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet proceeds to, with the full support of the U.S., proceeds to start rounding up people. No trials, no arrest warrants, just rounding people up. 30,000 people he rounds up. He puts them into concentration camps and military dungeons. His national security establishment, his military, his intelligence forces, his police rape people. They torture people, these 30,000 people. Out of the 30,000, they murder 3,000 of them after torturing or raping them. And interestingly enough, that Chile has gun control. And the Chilean people had said to Allende, we suspect a coup is coming, and arm us so that we can defend your regime against this other branch of the government, the military intelligence branch. And Allende said no. And so it was an easy thing for Pinochet to do this, to wreak this reign of terror over his own citizenry. One can imagine what it would have been like if they had been armed, like what happened to the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan, as you pointed out. Now, there's another valuable lesson here, is that the U.S. supported this dictatorship, which is an ominous thing. I mean, if you're supporting a dictatorship, it's usually because you believe in it. You think he was doing the right thing, and Pinochet was rounding up these people because they believed in communism. Well, you and I are libertarians. We would oppose communism with every fiber of our being, but we'd also say people have a right to believe in what they believe in, even if it's communism or Marxism, and you don't have a right to jail them for that or kill them. And then today, the same thing in Egypt. I mean, the Egyptian military dictatorship is a mirror image of Pinochet's, and here the U.S. is funneling the regime with armaments that enables them to enforce this tyranny. That, to me, is not a good sign, because you have to ask yourself, well, okay, that's one step removed from establishing that kind of tyranny here in the United States, but if circumstances required it, would the national security establishment do the same thing here if they had the right crisis or the right war? That's why I think it's a very ominous situation.
Oh, I agree. I think that if you look at the entire period following the end of the Second World War, the emergence of the Cold War, the U.S. government viewed itself on a global crusade to oppose communism as centered in Moscow and the Soviet Union. And their attitude was that anyone who was not pro-Soviet was therefore a supporter and therefore someone who should be given defensive assistance by the free world. And there were numerous third world governments in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America that were the recipients of American both financial as well as military foreign aid to arm their dictatorial forces, ending up oppressing their people because those people had little ways of physically defending themselves, all in the name that he may be a dictator and he may be using force and partly funded by us, but at least he's our dictator rather than Moscow's. And that is something that easily is fallen into, and it is made easier for governments to do this when their own citizenry are unarmed and have no sources of acquiring such self-defense weapons.
Yeah, and that raises how our ancestors felt about these huge military establishments. I mean, as you know, our American ancestors, the founders, the framers, they had a deep antipathy to these permanent professional military establishments. You can look at the quotes. We've got some great quotes on our website at fff.org of the antipathy towards standing armies. Just Google standing armies FFF. They hated these standing armies because they understood that this is the greatest threat to the freedom of people, to people's own citizenry. So not only did you have the Second Amendment that served as an insurance policy against tyranny, they didn't even bring into existence a permanent standing army, a CIA, an NSA for, 130 years, 150 years or so. So the government didn't even have the means of establishing a tyrannical regime, much less invade foreign countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay, they invaded Mexico in the Mexican War, but still you didn't have a huge military establishment. And after each war, they would dismantle, pursuant to this tradition, until, as you point out, World War II comes along and everything changes. They adopt what really is a totalitarian-like structure, big standing military establishment, CIA, secretive police, intelligence force, that has the omnipotent power to do covert operations, an NSA, which has a massive secret surveillance scheme. I mean, these are all inherent to, say, like China, which everybody knows is a tyrannical regime, or Egypt. Certainly was antithetical to the principles of a free society and limited government that America was founded on. And then the Cold War ends, Richard, and what happened? The thing did not go out of existence. We still have it. And so it's a straight line from post-World War II all the way up to the surveillance schemes, the assassination programs, the invasions, the occupations, and so forth.
Yes, I think that we have to realize that governments will use power if it's at their disposal, and bureaucracies take on a life of their own. One way of seeing this is that even if by some kind of a benchmark, the government's own meaning of a war on terror was to be victoriously achieved, that is, the terrorists were to be eliminated everywhere in the world as defined by the U.S. government itself, you will not see the end of the Department of Homeland Security or the NSA. The reason for this is that it is in their own self-interest to perpetuate rationales for budgets, jobs, promotions, and power. And that becomes a dangerous dynamic against which there has to be certain countervailing forces. To use the Founding Fathers' notions, checks and balances between segments of the society. And one of those counterbalances and countervailing forces is a citizenry that, in principle, if they choose to, as individuals, to have a right to bear arms and to be secure in those arms, to protect themselves against both private acts of aggression as well as some threat at some point in the future, if it ever arose, even from their own government.
Oh, that's a nice way to wrap up. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our one of our newest ebooks, which is absolutely a fantastic ebook. It's by Scott McPherson, who's been writing for the Future of Freedom Foundation for many, many years. It's one of the best writers in the movement. He's written this fantastic book called Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. It's available at Amazon. It really, most of the book is about how gun rights have provided to people in various parts of the world with the means to resist tyranny. And I cannot recommend the book highly enough. But Richard, on that note, we're out of time. As always, been a pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Until next time.
And we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.